I didn't laugh much the second time I watched Nanette, Hannah Gadsby's one-woman show disguised as a comedy special that totally and deservedly blew up after it hit Netflix last June. The hour, which focused on the intersection of trauma and her particular brand of self-deprecating comedy, gets dark quickly, and knowing the way that certain stories ultimately turn out makes it hard to find it all funny at the beginning. But unquestionably, it is effective. A key piece is the repeated desire to quit comedy entirely because she doesn't believe in its ability to let her process her trauma. She wants her story heard, but she doesn't want to be marginalized by her own work. Whatever disagreements folks may have about her view of self-deprecating comedy's limitations more broadly, Peter Moskowitz's review at The Outline is something I'll come back to in a bit. No one can invalidate the experience that she has had in life or on stage, and so she wants to leave and would be justified in doing so. But it's never clear what exactly she means by quitting comedy. Is she giving up performance entirely, or is Nanette a new baseline with intensely dramatic and painful storytelling replacing punchlines? Well, now we've got our answer in the form of Douglas, Gadsby's follow-up set currently being performed in New York City through August 22nd at the Darrell Roth Theater, which for 72 weeks was home to Derek Delgadio's magic show in and of itself, easily the best show I saw in 2017. Turns out, it was neither of those things. Douglas is absolutely a comedy show, and it is absolutely hilarious. Hello, by the way, and welcome to the Week in Review. You can call me a self-hating straight white man, because today I'm talking about Hannah Gadsby's Douglas. Sure, Gadsby said that after Louis C.K. decided to stage a return, that her work clearly wasn't done and she would be back. But again, it was never clear what that meant. Part of this is that neither I nor really anyone else around here has much broader context for Gadsby's work. She's been doing comedy for a decade, but never made it stateside until Nanette. As far as ha-ha comedy goes, she was still basically an unknown. But we got a glimpse of it immediately. As the lights went down, Madonna's Like a Prayer began to play as the projection screen switched to a wide-eyed photo of her with her dog, Douglas, successfully pulling off the blank look that I was attempting in the thumbnail of my Pokemon Detective Pikachu review. And then she came out and did something really, really weird. She told us what was going to happen over the course of the next hour and 45 minutes, because this comedy show is an hour and 45 minutes, and perhaps some explanation is warranted. Gadsby knows that we have all seen Nanette, that we are all there because we have seen Nanette, and that we don't really have any idea how she intends to follow it up. So she decides to tell us and to reset our expectations. We're going to get some stand-up, including a few observational bits about America that we need to not get too invested in. Then we'll get some needling of the patriarchy. Then that needling becomes something a little more. She dabs on the haters for a little while. Anti-vaxxers, it gets sad, though not quite as sad as Nanette, and then it gets funny again. Also, she's going to reveal to us that she has autism, and it will be a surprise, even though we know now, and if any of us have had experiences with people on the spectrum, that wouldn't be a total surprise, which would actually be good because she hates surprises. It's part of the autism. This whole thing is very funny, and importantly, none of it is at her own expense. In the wake of Nanette, she has turned away from self-deprecating humor, from the humiliation that she was putting herself through. In its wake, we have a performance that is much more self-confident and ready to take on the patriarchy. In Nanette, she did so largely through discussions of queerness. In Douglas, it's mostly through her neuroatypicality. It's interesting that she only just got the word to describe it, autism. She compares her experience of being on the spectrum as being the only sober person in a room full of drunk people, which, as a lifelong teetotaler, is actually something I can relate to. But that not knowing what to call it, or that it was even something that had a name, was like being in that room and not realizing that everyone else was drunk in the first place. She wasn't able to connect to why she couldn't connect. Words have value, and they mean things. They shape us and our lives and how we understand and be a part of our world. I know that we live in a time when people are performing literal, figurative backflips in order to try to convince people that they don't, but they must. Words are the reason you are metaphorically in this room with me right now. They're the reason I was actually in that room with Gadsby on Thursday. She's got a way with words. And they are used far more playfully in Douglas, a show absolutely bursting with puns, and just a general levity that even the funniest moments of Nanette never approached. Though this is more of a traditional stand-up set than its predecessor, that doesn't mean it's 105 minutes of punchlines. Far from it. For example, Gadsby still has that degree in art history she talked about last time around, and by gosh, is she going to use it. And she does so to great effect. I loved those parts of the show so much. Fuck the haters, dude. She spends some time talking about how much she actually enjoys short bursts of online hatred that are aimed at her, detailing specific things she hears over and over again, like people who no one will ever hear of tweeting at her to let her know that they've never heard of her. They're all the kinds of things that you hear from someone and then immediately assume that they're 7 years old and want to pat them on the head or pinch their little cheeks because, oh, it's so adorable that they're trying to have thoughts and it's not working. And she just gets such a kick out of it, which is awesome. And I get it. There are a lot of very bad reasons to hate Nanette, and most people who do are bad. Typically, I see someone saying Gadsby's show is not worth it as a pretty decent indicator that they are not worth it, which made it all the more surprising that The Outline posted a review called The Nanette Problem, since that didn't seem like the publication to get on that nonsense. But this review, written by queer journalist Peter Moskowitz, comes at it from a very different perspective and a few angles, one of which I found rather persuasive alongside others that did feel a bit much. The fact that I, and so many people who look like me, enjoyed Nanette is actually an indictment of the show. Because it's starting to say something, but then cuts itself off from really going there in much the same way that she cuts off the jokes at her trauma point. She isn't speaking truth to power because she's still asking for permission from people like me. And that is kind of true in Douglas as well, but in a somewhat stranger way. What struck me at the time was how she kept hedging certain bits, particularly the ones where she was making sweeping negative comments about the United States. Every single time, she would say a thing that was funny and true, and before we even had time to laugh, follow up with, "Don't get invested, don't get defensive." And I didn't understand why she would do that. I've seen plenty of shows in New York where people say far worse things about this country to wild applause, but she seemed unable to actually read the audience itself or comprehend that we might actually want a foreigner to come and tell us what's wrong with our society, which is a really cathartic thing to hear because we collectively internally are shouting, "I know, it's crazy, right?" But she kept undercutting it by immediately telling us to not take it personally, it was just a joke. The stuff about misogyny had a little bit less of that, and there are a few types of people who are unapologetically eviscerated. But I'm not gonna lie, I didn't really feel that targeted. She attacks structural misogyny, but stops short of pushing people who like to think of themselves as allies to really question their own behavior. Nanette did do some of that, but even then it was really much more heavily focused on the obviously bad people who do obviously bad things. The rest of us get to just laugh and think, wow, what a bad system. Sure would be good if people were nicer to each other, huh? With no real fear for the status quo. But let's be clear. Hannah Gadsby is not obligated to call for revolution. The last 5 minutes of Nanette are a bit frustrating, but it is not her job to change the world or fix society's ills. Her job is to give us her perspective, to make us think and probably laugh for some amount of time, and by God does she do both of those things with Douglas. We are there to learn from the life that Hannah Gadsby has had, from the pain that she has felt and the way that she has pushed through it to get to where she is now, because she is more successful than she could have ever dreamed, all thanks to a show about quitting. Funny how that works. 8.8 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, that's great. If not, I'm sorry. If you want to see more, please subscribe. I hope to see you next week.